You trained for open fields. You trained for frontal assaults. You trained to face an enemy you could see, hear, and outgun. But in Vietnam, the ground itself became the enemy. The jungle wasn't just terrain, it was a co-conspirator. Every step off the hardened path wasn't just a step into mud or foliage. It was a potential agreement with mutilation, a silent prayer that your next footfall wouldn't be your last conscious act as a whole man. The Viet Cong didn't just fight you, they weaponized the environment against you. They turned the act of walking, the most basic, thoughtless function of a soldier on patrol, into a high-stakes game of Russian roulette where the chamber was reloaded after every single painstakingly cleared yard. This was a war where the earth could open up, a tree could lash out, and a quiet village hut could hold a death sentence in its shadow. Welcome to the hidden war. Welcome to the realm of the booby trap. The psychological toll of this constant, invisible threat cannot be overstated. It eroded morale far more effectively than any artillery barrage. An artillery barrage had a beginning and an end. The fear of traps was eternal, a low-frequency hum of dread that vibrated in the skull of every man on patrol. It turned strong, confident soldiers into hesitant, nervous individuals, their eyes forever scanning the ground, their minds fraying from the unsustainable concentration required to spot the infinitesimal signs. A slight discoloration of the soil, a vine that seemed just too straight, a patch of leaves that didn't quite match. The enemy you could charge. The enemy you could call in an airstrike on. But how do you wage war against a bent sapling, a buried tin can, or a seemingly innocent length of twine? This was the genius and the horror of the Viet Cong's asymmetric warfare. They understood that to cripple a technologically superior army, you didn't need to match its firepower. You needed to attack its sense of security, its mobility, and most of all, its sanity. Let's talk about the instruments of this terror, starting not with complex mechanisms, but with primitive, organic horror given malicious intent. The punji stake. This was the Viet Cong's basic building block of pain, a sharpened shaft of bamboo, often fire-hardened to a vicious point. But its simplicity was its strength. It was undetectable by metal detectors, cheap to produce by the thousands, and endlessly versatile. And it was rarely clean. These stakes were frequently smeared with human or animal feces, contaminated with soil, or even tipped with toxins. The goal wasn't always a quick kill. The goal was a wound that would fester, that would scream with infection, that would take 1, 2, or 3 more men out of the fight to carry the victim to an evacuation point. A punji stake wound to the foot wasn't just an injury, it was a logistical nightmare and a potent psychological weapon broadcast to the entire unit. The most infamous application was the punji pit. Imagine a carefully dug pit, deeper than a man is tall, its bottom and sides studded with dozens of these poison spikes, angled upwards. The opening was then covered with a fragile lattice of twigs and a perfect carpet of natural foliage. From above, it was indistinguishable from the surrounding forest floor. A man falling into such a pit wasn't simply impaled. He was trapped in a nest of agony. The angled spikes made extraction a brutal, careful, and time-consuming ordeal, all while the victim screamed and his comrades stood guard, knowing the area was almost certainly covered by enemy snipers waiting for precisely this moment of chaos and vulnerability. It was a trap that turned a single misstep into a draining tactical crisis. But the earth swallowing you whole was only one variation of the nightmare. The Viet Cong were masters of leverage, tension, and simple physics, turning the very jungle into a weaponized pendulum. Take the spike board. To the untrained eye, it might look like a loose plank or a piece of debris, but it was a carefully balanced engine of death. One end, buried or weighted down, the other studded with those same vile punji stakes hidden under leaves. When a soldier's foot came down on the harmless-looking end, the board would pivot with violent speed, swinging the spiked end up with the force of a major league batter connecting with a fastball. It could slam into a man's chest, his face, his groin. There was no explosion, just the sickening wet thud of wood and metal meeting flesh, a gasp, and then the collapse. It was intimate. It was mechanical. It was a reminder that death didn't need electronics. It just needed a clever mind and a knowledge of how weight moves through space. And then there were the traps that played on the American soldier's sense of security, his desire for cover, for a moment's respite. The door trap. After a grueling patrol, a seemingly abandoned hut in a village could look like a gift. A place to get out of the rain, to check a map, to take a quick breath. But crossing that threshold was a covenant with calamity. Above the door, a T-shaped log or a heavy board, bristling with spikes, would be suspended, held back by a taut vine or wire connected to the door itself. The act of pushing the door open, an action as natural as breathing, was the trigger. The counterweight would release, and that spiked mass would swing down in a savage arc, aiming to crush a man's skull or drive spikes through his shoulders and chest. It transformed an act of seeking shelter into a death sentence. It taught a brutal lesson. In Vietnam, nothing was given. Not a step, not a breath, and certainly not the sanctuary of four walls. This constant, multi-directional threat, from below, from the sides, from ahead, created a paralyzing cognitive load. But the Viet Cong understood psychological warfare on a deeper level. They weaponized not just objects, but American instincts and morale. Consider the flagpole trap. They observed the symbolic act of an American soldier replacing the Viet Cong flag with the stars and stripes. They saw the desire for a souvenir, a tangible trophy of a cleared area, so they rigged the ultimate insult. The flagpole would be anchored over a buried artillery shell or a cluster of grenades, with a tripwire attached to the flag itself. Yanking down the enemy banner or raising your own became the act of self-destruction. It was a trap that perverted a gesture of victory into one of mutilation. It screamed, "Your symbols are meaningless here. Your pride is your weakness." The ingenuity was diabolical, and it extended to recycling the very tools of American warfare. The grenade in a can trap was a masterpiece of minimalist terror. A simple food can, a sea ration can, with a grenade inside. The safety pin is pulled, but the spoon is held down by the sides of the can. One end of a wire is tied to the grenade, the other to a stake across a trail. A soldier, seeing a piece of trash, might give it an idle kick. Or, in a moment of desperate hope, think it was left behind rations. The moment the can moved, the grenade would roll free, the spoon would fly off, and the countdown, or more often the instantaneous explosion, if they filed down the delay element, would begin right at his feet. It turned American manufacturing against the American soldier, using his own supplies to fuel his dismemberment. But perhaps the most universally dreaded were the traps that introduced an element of the chaotic, the living, and the uncontrollable. The snake pit, a deep hole, its bottom a writhing mass of bamboo vipers or other venomous snakes. Falling into a punji pit was a tragedy. Falling into a snake pit was a descent into a particular, slithering hell. The initial fall might break bones, but then the strikes would come. Not one, but multiple, as the panicked animals attacked the intruder in their prison. Rescue was almost impossible. It was a death viewed as particularly gruesome and undignified, a fate that spoke to a primal, deep-seated fear. Similarly, the hornet's nest trap weaponized nature's fury. A carefully relocated nest of Asian giant hornets, some of the most aggressive and painfully venomous insects on Earth, would be placed in a box connected to a tripwire. When triggered, the box would open, releasing a cloud of winged agony. The instinct to run, to flail, to escape the torturous stings would inevitably send men crashing blindly through the undergrowth, often straight into the waiting punji pits or other traps laid in a deadly perimeter. It was a 1-2 punch. First psychological and physical torment, then the lethal finale. This was the environment. This was the reality. Every mission was conducted under a silent, invisible dome of potential agony. The jungle wasn't just hiding the enemy, it had become the enemy. And for the grunt on the ground, the true victory wasn't taking a hill or securing a village. The true victory, earned minute by minute, step by agonizing step, was simply making it back to the fire base at the end of the day, with your body and your mind still somewhat intact. This unrelenting hidden war of nerves and spikes and tripwires forced a fundamental change in the American soldier's psychology. You weren't just fighting the Viet Cong. You were fighting your own instincts, your own fatigue, your own desire for a moment of normalcy. The term booby trap itself sounds almost childish, trivial, but there was nothing trivial about the carnage they wrought. Medical reports from the theater detail wounds that were medieval in their savagery, deep punctures, ragged tears, compound fractures from falling into pits, and devastating soft tissue damage from explosions at point-blank range. The infection rate was staggering. A soldier might survive the initial impalement only to face a grueling battle against gangrene, septicemia, or tetanus, fought on a medevac chopper or in a field hospital. This environment bred a specific and profound type of fatigue, not just physical exhaustion from humping the hills, but a mental burnout from the unsustainable state of hypervigilance. Your eyes would ache from scanning. Your neck would be stiff from the tension. You'd watch the man in front of you, tracing his footsteps exactly. A macabre game of follow the leader, where the penalty for innovation was mutilation. It eroded unit cohesion in subtle ways. The careless soldier wasn't just a liability to himself. He was a walking trigger that could maim his friends. It could breed resentment, fear, and a paralyzing caution that contradicted every aggressive instinct the military had drilled into you. And then there was the aftermath. For every KIA, there were multiple soldiers suffering severe, life-altering injuries from these devices. Lost feet, legs, hands, abdominal wounds that meant colostomies and a lifetime of complications, spinal injuries, facial disfigurement. The tripwire that triggered a grenade didn't just end a patrol, it could end a man's vision of his own future. The war didn't end when they medevaced you out. For thousands, it simply changed venues, moving from the booby-trapped trails of Quang Ngai to the rehabilitation wards in VA hospitals back home, where a different kind of long, painful struggle began. A struggle with pain management, prosthetics, PTSD, and the haunting question of why me, that a random piece of bamboo or a buried 105mm shell fragment had answered with such arbitrary cruelty. The legacy of these traps is not just in the statistics or the medal citations for bravery under fire. It's etched into the very doctrine of the modern U.S. military. The lessons learned in those jungles about counterinsurgency, about the psychological dimension of warfare, about the need for situational awareness that goes far beyond spotting a uniformed enemy, were paid for in blood and trauma. They shaped the training for future conflicts, where IEDs in Iraq and Afghanistan would present a hauntingly familiar, if technologically evolved, nightmare. The names changed, improvised explosive device instead of booby trap. But the core truth remained. The most devastating weapon isn't always the one with the longest range or the biggest payload. It's the one you don't see coming, the one that turns your environment against you, and the one that targets your mind as surely as it targets your body. For the American veteran who walked those trails, the memory isn't just of an enemy. It's of the silence between the bird songs. It's of the way a patch of dirt looked just a little too smooth. It's of the cold sweat that had nothing to do with the heat, and the profound earned relief of hearing the thump, thump, thump of a Huey after a patrol where the ground did not claim another friend. You didn't just serve in Vietnam, you navigated it, and that was a battle all its own. This hidden war beneath the boots demanded its own grim science, a new breed of soldier and desperate countermeasures. The U.S. military wasn't just fighting men, it was fighting an idea, the idea that terrain could be maliciously intelligent. And so the response evolved, born from equal parts ingenuity, frustration, and raw necessity. Enter the tunnel rats. If the jungle floor was a minefield, the earth beneath it was a literal labyrinth of death. The vast network of Cu-Chi tunnels and thousands like it weren't just hideouts. They were subterranean fortresses, complete with hospitals, barracks, and armories. Sending a regular grunt down there was a death sentence. So the army sought out the small, the slender, and the unnervingly brave. Men no taller than 5 feet 5 inches, armed often with just a .45 pistol, a knife, and a flashlight, would descend into that absolute darkness. Claustrophobia was a luxury they couldn't afford. Their world shrunk to the diameter of a flashlight beam, their ears straining in the silence for the click of a pressure plate, their skin crawling at the thought of what might be tied to that next tripwire. Not just grenades, but boxes of scorpions, vipers coiled on ledges, or punji pits dug right into the tunnel floor. A tunnel rat's job was a slow-motion, solitary duel in the dark, where winning meant inching forward another 10 feet and living to whisper a map coordinate back to the surface. Their courage was of a different, quieter kind, a voluntary descent into a buried tomb that was very much alive and waiting. Above ground, the technological might of the U.S. military found itself baffled by bamboo and string. How do you counter an enemy who invests pennies and seconds to cost you a man and a mission? One brutal answer was Operation Ranch Hand, the infamous defoliation campaign. The logic was stark: no jungle, no cover for traps. So the planes rolled in, spraying Agent Orange and other herbicides by the millions of gallons. It was an attempt to strip the Viet Cong of their greatest ally, the concealing, omnipresent green mantle of Vietnam. The landscape would be scorched, left barren and exposed. In the short term, it may have cleared fields of fire, but it created a different kind of hellscape, a chemical one, and wrote a legacy of suffering for Vietnamese civilians and American GIs alike that would span generations. It was a testament to the sheer desperation these traps inspired, the willingness to destroy the environment itself to deny its use as a weapon. And then there were the animals. The war dogs, primarily German shepherds, trained to sniff out explosives and ambushes. They were lifesavers, their keen noses often detecting the scent of disturbed earth, metal, or even the enemy long before a human could. But they too became targets. The Viet Cong learned to mask trap sites with pepper, American-made soap, or captured uniform fragments to confuse them. They also baited areas to draw the dogs in, making the handler and his unit follow into a kill zone. The loss of a dog was a profound blow. It wasn't just the loss of a tool, it was the loss of a trusted comrade who had saved lives, a psychic wound to the unit's sense of security. This constant grinding pressure of the trap war didn't just cause casualties, it shaped strategy and colored every interaction. It's the unspoken context behind the infamous Zippo raids and village searches that could turn violent with terrifying speed. When every hut could harbor a door trap, every seemingly friendly farmer could have marked a path with hidden stakes, and every child could be a lookout, paranoia became a survival mechanism. The fear of the unseen device fed a suspicion of everything and everyone. It lowered the threshold for the use of overwhelming firepower. If you couldn't safely enter a village, the grim calculus might suggest you neutralize it from a distance. The booby trap was a catalyst for a broader, more total kind of warfare, eroding the lines between combatant and civilian, between caution and rage. The American soldier adapted, as soldiers always do. He learned to walk not just with his eyes, but with a probing stick, testing the ground ahead. He developed a sixth sense for something off in the arrangement of the foliage. He listened to the seasoned veteran who said, "If it looks too good to be true, it's probably trapped." The perfectly clear path? Avoid it. The inviting, dry spot to sit? Don't. The abandoned, intact rifle? Allure. Survival became a curriculum of distrust, taught in real time by the maimed and the dead. So what was the real cost? Beyond the numbers, beyond the wounds. It was a fundamental rewiring of the combat experience. In Vietnam, valor wasn't just found in assaulting a hill. It was found in the sheer, exhausting will to place one foot in front of the other, hour after hour, in a world designed to break you from the ankles up. The booby trap was the ultimate equalizer. It didn't care about your rank, your training, or your firepower. It turned the jungle into a silent, patient adversary that never slept, never retreated, and never showed mercy. That silent war of nerves, the one fought in the space between heartbeats, in the glance at a suspicious vine, that war never truly ends for the man who fought it. The ground of Vietnam held more than mud and roots. It held a legacy of tension, and every soldier who walked it carries a piece of that tension home. This isn't just history, it's the terrain of memory. For those who walk the point, we remember.